Okay, so in this lecture, I want to cover the other slides about cognitive theory, and maybe I'll get to contextual theory too. Sorry to break those two up, but so remember, cognitive theory, we're talking about Piaget's theory, Piaget's ideal in the last lecture. In this one, so in this case, there's just a couple other ways of thinking about cognitive theory. At least there's lots of other ways, but for our purposes. So one fella, his name is Vygotsky, I like to say that name, he suggests that the way that we learn to think is culturally influenced. Vygotsky, or because partly of what we're learning is through interaction with the environment, right? So our cognitive development is influenced or informed by our interaction with other people. So this does sort of make sense if you think about a child who lives in isolation or who has limited social interaction will in fact experience cognitive impairment, because the way they learn about their brain, their interaction with their brain, is what creates stimulation and connection. And so it's through this interacting with others that we learn to think. And not only that, as we learn to interact with others, we learn to think in the language of our culture. Right, so this is kind of an abstract idea. Vygotsky, and there's another, forget the other guy's name, we talked more about him in the sociology class, but the theory is that we think in the language that we speak. In other words, our thoughts are in words, right? Our thoughts are in language, and the more language that we have, the more specific and the more nuanced our thoughts can be. I mean, you might just try that for a second and see, like think about something. And I know on my drive over here in the morning, I think the whole time. I mean, I do a lot of thinking on my way to work, and those thoughts are in the language in which they're in my words, they're in English. Now, if you speak multiple languages, this can be really clear because in some languages, they may not translate exactly. In Spanish, for instance, they have more than one language for the word, more than one word for the concept of love. In English, we only have one kind of love. So theoretically, then people who speak Spanish can experience or contemplate different kinds of love that English-only speakers can't contemplate because their language is limited in how they can conceptualize or how they can think about things. Hence, well, the way we think is informed by others in our culture and the language that others in our culture have. So thinking about toddlers, right, the terrific twos, which I mentioned in a previous slide, this is about the time that there's a lot of rapid cognitive development. And what some argue is that these tantrums, and I say that because that these expressions of frustration that we see within of 2-year-olds is they don't have the words to express what they're experiencing, and they act out, right? If they can, and so what caregivers can do is help them, give them the words, or how frustrated grown-ups feel when they just can't put into words how they're feeling. And this is what therapists help us do, is therapists help us label what we're feeling. And sometimes simply knowing, oh, that is anxiety. That can be very comforting. So again, it's the idea that we think within the structure of our language. And the bigger our vocabulary, the more words we have, the more specific we can think, and therefore the more specific we can communicate. Okay, so that's part of this idea of Vygotsky. He also, if any of you want to be teachers, you'll learn about this, but there's or maybe you're at home, doing homeschool with your children, but there's a concept called scaffolding. And it's we talk a lot about it in education. And scaffolding is the idea that you can't take a kindergartner and teach them algebra, that you have to teach them basic arithmetic steps along the way, kind of like what you do if you're training your dog, right? You teach them in little pieces. You can't just go from A to Z, but instead we scaffold our knowledge, right? That My daughter is convinced that the reason she doesn't do very good in college algebra is because she was out sick when they were learning division when she was in elementary school, right? But scaffolding is the idea that you learn a little bit here and then you learn a little bit more that builds on what you already know. With this sweet spot, this step in between, and I do put this on a quiz. I must not do very good at explaining it because students have a hard time explaining it back to me. But the idea is that between what you know and what, say, you need to know, there's something called a zone of proximal development, which is a fun phrase. The zone of proximal development is the space between what I already know and what I can come to know with a little bit of assistance. So you're really comfortable, say, with, I'm sort of at a loss. You're really comfortable with all of your basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but you got to get to calculus, right? Well, that's probably not, it's probably too big of a step, but you got to get to college algebra, right? If the instructor walks me through each of those steps, I can get it. I can't quite get it by myself. That is the zone of proximal development, is the space. So what is challenging as an educator or even as a coach, right? And maybe you're a coach or as a parent, is figuring out how to figuring out where people are already at. So a lot of like colleges or classes, they'll have like a pre-test. Okay, tell me what you already know. You know, you go back to school, tell me, let's take the pre-test. What do you remember from last semester? Okay, I need you to get to here. And so we're going to take these incremental steps to get you to there. If we're shooting as educators or anyone, if you're trying to shoot too high, that can be frustrating to the learner and they can give up. Or if you're not high enough, that can be boring to the learner and they can also give up. So we're most successful in our coaching, in our training, and our learning if we're in that zone of proximal development, right? What I can get with a little bit of help, and then theoretically, what I can get with a little bit of help, eventually I can get that all by myself. And then we raise it, we scaffold, we build on our knowledge, which is why probably this class should have a prereq of psych, right? So that you've been introduced to these ideas. It's also why very often in college, the intro classes, students, the lowest, like the first psych class or the first algebra class is often the hardest, and students don't perform very well in that one. When they get to upper division, they start performing better. It's not because the content's easier, it's because the content is, and then this also comes out of like memory models, it's attached to something. It's built on top of something else instead of just kind of floating around and they're all by itself. Okay, I hope that makes some sense. If it doesn't, let me know if I can try to explain zone of proximal development. And then the last cognitive theory here is sort of I don't think it's quite as interesting as those other two, but it's sort of the idea that our brains are just like computers, right? That you have inputs and you have outputs, and you can't output anything unless the data comes in right. So what we used to say, I used to do data analysis, you know, for a living, and we used to say garbage in, garbage out. In other words, if you give me bad data or data that is all messed up or doesn't answer the question, what the output, what I produce for you isn't going to be any good. If I get information that is clear and I can easily organize it in my mind, it's going to be much easier for me to explain it, right? Right. So it's like a computer. You have inputs and you have outputs. In all of our behaviors, it says are calculations. And we systematically sort of go through all of the options, right? All of the data that we know, when we put all that data together and we print out or we output a behavior or a thought or an emotional expression. And so, as the theory would go, right, sort of like proximal development, sort of like other theories, is that the more I have, the more data I have, the better output, right? The more life experiences. My brain can work fancier calculations if I have more data, if I have more, more data. Okay, finally, we wrapped up cognitive development. I only have, 2 more to go. All right, gonna stop here.